You're listening to the Kingdom Project Podcast. These are discussions on biblical theology and interpretation. The emphasis is on context and grace. The goal is to promote biblical literacy by displacing and debunking most modern interpretations. The challenge is to engage in healthy conversation that may stretch but sharpen iron. This is the Kingdom Project, and I'm your host, Marcus Hall. Welcome everybody to a new episode in the series on the book of Revelation. This will be episode 6. Episode 6 going into chapter 6 and several other chapters here as well. We'll go through some little highlights and little points, things like that, okay? So we've been looking at this and we've gone through the last episode was on 4 and 5, and the emphasis there was the seven sealed scroll. And now we're going to be looking at the opening of the first 4 seals, and this is going to be focused on the 4 horses and the horsemen. I need to turn my volume up here so I can hear myself. There we go. All right. All right, so I don't feel I need to recap. If you've been following along, you should know where we're at, doing these week by week. Hopefully, you know what's going on. Okay, I'm trying to keep track myself. So far, here's by the time this is published and it airs, see, I already have one's been released. The first one has been released and published now for streaming and download. I have 2, 3, 4, and 5 recorded and uploaded and ready to be released, all in different dates. So by the time you get to this, by the time this is out, it should be August. That's what I'm planning for. It should be after August, actually. It's probably August 14th. We'll see how that turns out and show you how scheduled I am. Okay, so I purposely recorded about the 5 enepisodes, and then to have those out, and then hopefully in this time frame, in 4 weeks, I will finish this series. And the next, by the time the 5th episode is out, I'm hoping to be done with however many more there are to go, which I think this will probably go. This is episode 6. It'll probably go to either 12 or 13. Okay, so, all right, we've covered the 7 sealed scroll, and here we're going to explain what happens as the 7 seals were opened. All right, so this is the first group of 7 in the 3 sevens. All right, and as we move here from chapter 6 through, it'll be through chapter 8, verse 5. Okay, so following 8:5, 8:6 speaks of the beginning of the 7 trumpets, which is the second group of the 3 sevens. Okay, and then that will lead all the way up to chapter 16, where the 7 bowls of wrath will be poured out, and that is the third group of the 3 sevens. So the opening of the seals of the 7 sealed scroll was God's way of declaring judgment on the Jews of the Old Covenant who rejected Messiah, the Jesus Christ, and it was God's answer to persecuted Christians who were crying out for vengeance. Okay. Also, remember that John was given a preview of what was to happen as the city of Jerusalem fell in 70 AD. And so these are descriptions of what will happen, okay, will happen in the first century after John writes the Revelation. Okay, so let's look at the function of each seal. All right, the opening of the first four seals triggers this appearance of the four horsemen. And these four horsemen are on the land who had the authority to declare the judgment to come. The opening of the fifth seal moved all of this action from earth to heaven, where the martyred saints are crying out for vengeance. The sixth seal described the fear of men in Jerusalem as they were confronted with the declaration of God's judgment. And the seventh seal predicted an increase in prayer for vengeance, as well as the initiation of the blowing of the seven trumpets. So between the opening of the sixth and the seventh seals, there's like an interlude, okay? And its purpose was to identify the Christians who would still be in Jerusalem before its final destruction, okay? They needed to get out and escape, flee to the hills of Judea, and God wasn't going to let them die in this catastrophe, okay? So that the Christians in Jerusalem would be identified by a seal on their forehead. So God's judgment on the land of Israel and Jerusalem would come in these increments rather than all at once, okay? Actually over a period of 3.5 years, okay? This was the reason John said in chapter 6 that at first only a portion of the land, which is a fourth, would be affected, okay? So let me just read Revelation chapter 6, verse 1, I believe. Yeah, now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures say that with a voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. Okay, so and then the portion of the land, like I said, this is in verse 8, and I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. There's my dog barking in the background. Hades followed him, and they were given authority over a fourth of the land to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by wild beasts of the earth. So the declaration of judgment would come with signs. Signs always point to something else that's greater than the sign itself, and these signs were partial judgments on this land, okay? And they would come as these destructive forces. And they were all pointing to the final and the complete outcome or destruction of Jerusalem that would come later, okay? So let's talk about the four horsemen here, okay? We know this, four horsemen of the apocalypse. It's a very big visual and apocalyptic themes and movies and whatnot, even in music and songs. The horsemen are drawing nearer, on leather steeds they ride, right? It's a Metallica song. So the first four seals are identified with four horsemen and four horsemen. And like I said, you've probably heard of them. All right. So these four horsemen on these horses would reveal to apostate Israel by means of signs that God had declared this judgment against them. Okay, so there's four different horses. Each is a different color. The first was white, and the rider wore a crown, and he went out upon the earth, conquering to conquer. White symbolizes purity, but it also can symbolize victory, okay? Jesus will come later riding a white horse, but it's in much greater power and glory, and that's in chapter 19, okay? So this rider announced with signs what would shortly come to pass as would the other three that are coming. Okay, now Gentry suggests that the horseman on the white horse represented the approach of the Roman army that happened in March of 67 AD, which was the first formal engagement of the Roman army with Jerusalem. Okay, now with the breaking of the second seal, there's a red horse, and its rider went out to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another. Okay, now the color red typically symbolizes blood in the Bible. Okay, so with the signs that accompanied the declaration of judgment, then obviously that implication would be there would be blood. Now the peace that Israel had under Rome would be taken away. This was the Pax Romana, okay? This is the peace that Rome brought to her empire by sheer fear and force. But that's when Jesus tells the disciples in the Olivet Discourse, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. That was something new to them because they were under this Pax Romana. But this was going to be removed from the land of Israel. Okay, so this was this is significant, especially when you tie it to the Olivet Discourse. Okay, so because it's the end of the Old Covenant. You know, you could say God's removed his hand now from Israel on this and allowing Rome to do the things that they're doing. God's grace is removed from them because they're unfaithful covenant breakers, if you will. Okay, so then when this happened, then the men would begin to fight and war with one another. And during this time, the civil war occurred within the city of Jerusalem among a number of factions of the Jewish leaders at that time. All right, so then the third seal is broken. The third rider comes forth on a black horse. Black symbolizes famine or a shortage of food, okay? Now, in Lamentations, chapter 4, verse 8, those affected by famine are described in terms of the color black, and it says, their appearance is blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin is shriveled on their bones. It is withered, and it has become like wood. Now, so here in Revelation, the third rider carried a pair of scales in his hand that symbolized the inflated price of the food, okay? Because it mentions that a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine, okay? So a denarius was a day's wage, and this is demonstrating the high cost of food. All right, think of your day's wage today only allowing you to buy a loaf of bread. Socialism. Okay, so now Josephus describes what was going on in Jerusalem prior to that destruction, okay? And he explained that one of the militant factions that was led by a man named Simon had set on fire houses that were full of corn and all of the other provisions. All right, now if you think about the tithe, the taxation, and the theocracy that had gone on in the Old Covenant, you brought your food, you brought what you grew, part of being a farmer and things like that. You brought that to where? The storehouse. All right. There's also, I don't know if I'll come to this at some point, but there was a man named John Levi. He said he was the Messiah. Okay. Christ said there would be false Christ, anointed ones. He comes in, sits in the temple and says, hey, get rid of all the food, get rid of everything, burn it all up, and I will provide for you. This obviously was false. He was not an anointed man, and it caused them to go hungry. Okay, so you can read a lot more in the Wars of the Jews by Josephus for things like that. Okay, John tells us that the wheat and the barley was very scarce, so because of these things. But evidently the oil and the wine, they were not to be touched, so perhaps they weren't touched, okay? But this was a famine that was caused by the Jews themselves, not by the Roman army, okay? So during this famine, it's going to get a little grisly here if you're squeamish. So I'm just giving you a heads up. But there were reports of cannibalism, okay? Cannibalism is actually mentioned as part of the covenant curses that God brings upon his rebellious people, okay? These are in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 28:53. It says, "Then you shall eat the offspring of your own body, the flesh of your sons and of your daughters, whom the Lord your God has given you, during the siege and the distress by which your enemy will oppress you." Few verses later, in 56 and 57, it says, "The refined and delicate woman among you, who would not venture to set the sole of her foot on the ground for delicateness and refinement, shall be hostile toward the husband she cherishes, and toward her son and daughter, and toward her afterbirth, which issues from between her legs, and toward her children who she bears. For she will eat them secretly for lack of anything else during the siege and the distress by which your enemy will oppress you in your towns." Yeah, so this did happen. It happened before the Romans actually reached the city. It was a sign of the declaration of God's judgment. It would actually appear then that the worst enemies of the Jews were the Jews. They had more fear from their own people than they did the Romans, okay? Some Jews considered the Romans as possible saviors from the evil of their own people, okay? But in Josephus, there's accounts of these things happening. A woman roasting her child and saving a part of it for some of the people who came to smell the smell and things like that. I won't go into much detail of that. You can read that for yourself. It's some rough stuff. There's a lot of that type of stuff that's in these historical writings. And nevertheless, though, there's proof that these things happened. Okay, now, finally, we have the opening of the fourth seal, and this is the color is gray, green, or pale. It's a pale horse that came forth. The name of the rider was Death. He was given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine, with pestilence. I read that. So, yeah, gray or pale is the color of death, okay? People are going to die during this time. Again, this is another sign of the declaration of the judgment to come. Now, what's up with the four horsemen, okay? So, remember, interpret Scripture with Scripture. To understand the metaphors of the four horsemen, we're going to compare Scripture then, okay? Because there's a parallel passage in the Old Testament where there were four horses with four various colors, okay? It's in Zechariah. The prophet had a similar vision in chapter 1, verse 8, and it says, "I saw at night, and behold, a man was riding on a red horse, and he was standing among the myrtle trees which were in the ravine, with red, sorrel, and white horses behind him." And then it goes on in verse 10 that we are told that the task of the horsemen was to patrol the earth. Okay, so the concept of four horsemen in Revelation is not new. Four horses have already appeared in Zechariah. So their mission there was to prepare the land for final judgment. So the four horses here had the same mission in Revelation. So, as these actual events transpired and as the Roman armies approached Jerusalem, the Jews would see the signs of God's final judgment in dead bodies resulting from famine, eaten by the beasts of the earth, them killing and cannibalizing. And these covenant curses in Deuteronomy predicted this in the following way in 28:26. It says, "Your carcasses will be food to all birds of the sky and to the beasts of the earth, and there will be no one to frighten them away." Now, not all the Israelites would die, but nearly a fourth of them would before the Romans even approached the walls of the fortified city. Okay, so now we go to the fifth seal. And this returns this goes from now earth to heaven, and in heaven we find the response of these martyrs as they saw the seven-sealed scroll being opened. Okay, now, interesting here, a lot of people are big, this is a side note, on resurrection of the dead, that nobody's in heaven. There has to be this final resurrection of the living and the dead, and the final judgment. They take place at the same time, at the end of time. Well, there's no end of time. There's only a time of an end. And if people were not going to heaven until Revelation is over with, and this is about the end of the world, why are there martyrs in heaven? Because they are there. Okay, so, and they are anxious to see the judgment of God on those who had put them to death for their faith in the gospel. 6:9 says, I'm just going to read 6, 9, 10, and 11 here. Okay. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, "O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer, until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. All right, so they're given a white robe. This is righteousness. There's going to be more martyrs that take place. Okay, so we've talked about phrases like a little while longer. Okay, this should reaffirm the position as to the timing. This is, actually, this is time restriction here. Okay, the time was near. God was going to avenge in just a little while longer. That surely cannot mean 2,000 years later in the future. If there was to be no relief shortly, then either God was mistaken or not telling the truth. Okay, so I conclude that these events of Revelation must have occurred during the first century. Okay, now I keep saying that, but I believe it's important. Now, also notice how these 9 through 11 that I just read limits the word earth. Okay. It limits the word earth to the land of Israel. Okay, I made that point in another episode. So the martyrs were calling for the death of those who persecuted them on the earth, but it was the land. Okay, the word earth cannot mean the whole entire earth, or it possibly couldn't even maybe refer as defined by the extent of the Roman Empire. The earth here, the land, was the location of the persecution which had taken place. Okay, those Christians there that are in heaven were slain for the faith. Before John wrote the book, they were praying for vengeance for their own blood, and this vengeance was directed against those who pierced him. In chapter 1, verse 7, those who pierced him lived in the land of Israel. Stephen is considered the first martyr of the church in Acts 7, and these prayers were fully answered later when the 7 bowls of wrath are poured out. So this vengeance was predicted by Jesus himself. This is in Matthew 23, 34, and 36. And after Jesus pronounced the woes on the scribes and Pharisees, he went on to say, I'm sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you, all right, them, may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood that's been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, who you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Now, we should know by now this generation was that generation. It was the first century generation. So, it should be obvious that here in Revelation, it's speaking of that same judgment that Jesus pronounced in the book of Matthew against the scribes and the Pharisees in that generation, okay? So this is limited then, okay? This limited the recipients of God's judgment in Revelation to those people in that generation of the New Testament era and to their followers. Jesus spoke of the destruction of the temple in 24:2, right? We know this, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. The disciples had just asked him about the temple and all that. So I've gone through all that, but the exact timing of this judgment was revealed in 24:34. 24:34, when he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So the generation of Jesus and the apostles watched these events occur in Jerusalem. So then we go to the breaking of the sixth seal, and we're given an image of how much men in the land would fear God's judgment. And this fear was going to be so great that they would hide themselves in caves among the rocks and the mountains, and they were going to say to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us, hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand. This is the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy in Luke 23:30, when it says, then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. All right. Now, futurists put this judgment sometime obviously in the future beyond our present age, but I believe it pertains to that destruction of Jerusalem again. Okay. Why are we going to be... I don't have a cave or a mountain to hide in, okay? This cannot be a global event. You just got to start thinking logically here, okay? So, back to the Old Testament again, okay? The language used with the opening of the sixth seal is also metaphorical. Should not be taken literally. Because it says, I looked when he broke the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell on earth as a fig tree cast its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. The sky was split apart like a scroll, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. So, if you go to the Old and the New Testaments for similar language, you're going to find this is very common language to describe major events of destruction that's happened throughout Israel's history. I know I've touched upon that a lot in the eschatology series and stuff like that. Okay, so this metaphorical language of a darkened world is very common. So the most common example is by the prophet Joel, when he said the sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. That's Joel 2:31. It's not to be taken literally. Now, and we know Peter tells us Joel's prophecy was fulfilled at the day of Pentecost, and that's in Acts 2:20. He said specifically that what they were seeing was the fulfillment of the words of Joel. Okay, so another example of this is in Isaiah chapter 13, where the prophet spoke specifically about the Old Testament city of Babylon, and it says in verse 10 that Isaiah is describing the judgment against Babylon in the following terms. He says, "For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light." So the point of all these images, it's not to be taken literal. It's apocalyptic language. Darkness was the judgment of God, and that judgment would be so catastrophic that only such figurative language could actually be used to describe it. So to interpret these prophecies as if these things were to happen only literally, it misses the whole point, and it would mean that these things happened even in Old Testament times, and if they had, we would not be around. That should be obvious, okay? So, again, it's just metaphorical. It's apocalyptic, okay? The world would be changed, but it would never be the same, but it's not the end of the world, okay? So a bad day can happen. Catastrophic events could happen. You could think of this in our day if a day that, if we talked this way, like 9/11 could have been like that for us who live in the States. All right. That's something that occurred in history. And it changed a lot of things from that day on. So, but here, it's apocalyptic, but it does lend to some imagery because destruction has that type of imagery, okay? Now we have a little interlude that chapter 6 through 8, 5 deal with the opening of the seals of the seven-sealed scroll. Chapter 6 begins with the opening of the first of the seven seals, and in chapter 8, 5, the seventh seal was opened, okay? So the blowing of the seven trumpets would begin in chapter 8, verse 6. Okay, but chapter 7 of Revelation is an interlude, okay? This is a break. John seems to be building up to something here, okay? All of a sudden there's this break, there's this interlude in order to say that something else of equal importance, okay? And the purpose of the interlude becomes clear. It's in chapter 7, like I said. The declaration of judgment against Jerusalem was put on hold until God had put a mark on the Christians and allowed them to escape from the city. So let me cue this up. Let me go to it. This is chapter 7, 1 through 3. It says, "After this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, that no wind might blow on earth or sea or against any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun with the seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm earth and sea, saying, 'Do not harm the earth or the seas or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads.'" Okay, now then you get into the 144,000 number, okay? So, winds are used in the Bible to describe power, the power and the force of God. And John said that God would hold back the winds of judgment until the servants, the Christians, had their foreheads marked and escaped from the city. Now, during this destruction that was happening. So God provided a way out of the city for the servants before it was completely destroyed, okay? Now, this is referred to in Matthew where God warns those who are in the city to flee to the mountains, okay? When it says, "Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get things out that are in their house, or if you're in the field, don't turn back and get your cloak. All right. The Christians had to flee. If they flee, they're going to be saved. And that from all that was going to come at the hands of the Romans. Okay. And, now in, the Roman army had surrounded Jerusalem. Okay. So like there's different takes on this, but I've actually went through this in Matthew, on the Matthew 24 series, when the days would be cut short. Okay, Roman armies had come, they had surrounded the city, and they just stop, and they go back. And when they come back, they return, and okay, they had retreated from their positions. Okay, so there was this pause in the battle, and this facilitated the Christians' escape from the city. Okay, now part then also is this: they need a mark to be identified. God would set them apart so that they would be preserved, and they're going to have this mark on the forehead. Okay, so in biblical terms, God knows who his servants are, and here he's declared that he was going to deliver them from this destruction. So they were described as, in verse 14, and let me go there. These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. There you go. That means they were cleansed through the blood of Christ. They were new creations. The Great Tribulation was the process of Jerusalem's destruction. They're the ones coming out of it. Okay, these Jewish Christians are described also in these terms of the 12 tribes of Israel by the number 144,000. And this is could be a reference to the Jewish Christians living in Jerusalem and those who came from the 12 tribes. Okay, so we have to, a lot of times we forget, but we should remember the early Christians were Jewish first, then to the Gentiles. Okay, we often forget that a lot of times, but the number is symbolic, and it can, that's an edit there. You probably didn't notice it, but the outro music kicked on because I forgot to mute it. So the number 144,000 can easily be associated with the math, the product of 12 tribes times 12 apostles times 1,000. Okay, the number 1,000 is symbolic of completeness, so the number 1,000 is not meant to be an exact number, right? We know that God owns cattle on 1,000 hills, but he really owns all the cattle, right? So, but the number 1,000 symbolizes all the hills in all of the earth. So the number 144,000 is a symbolic number of Christians from the 12 tribes of Israel, converted to Christ through the gospel, through the work of the 12 apostles who would be delivered at that particular point in this battle before the total destruction came on Jerusalem. So they would be known by a seal on their forehead. Okay, so do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the bond servants of our God on their foreheads. So destruction would be delayed until these Christians were delivered out of the city. And that means we need to explain the nature of that seal and why it was on the foreheads. A lot of different takes on that, okay? But, okay, what do seals mean in the Bible? Okay, seals are symbolic. They're not to be taken literally. Signs and seals are found throughout all of the Bible. So we know that seals appeared in Revelation 5 on the seven-sealed scroll, okay? They define ownership. This scroll belonged only to God, okay? So the mark or the seal of God on the forehead of Christians meant they belonged to him, okay? So the mark defined ownership. I don't want to be generic here, but it's like a logo. Okay, just think of a logo. Think of a brand or something, a branding. Seals and marks and badges tells you who owns you, or who you derive your power from. Okay. In Romans 4:11, circumcision that was administered in the Old Testament was called a seal, because it says he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of faith, which he had while uncircumcised. Now in the New Testament, baptism is a seal that unites us to Christ. So in the sacraments, the seals represents the authority of God acting in the sacrament. So the concept of a seal is not new. Christians are identified in the book of Ephesians as those who have been sealed with the seal of God, the mark. In him you also, after listening to the message of truth, the gospel of your salvation, having also believed, you were sealed in him with the Holy Spirit of promise, who is given as a pledge of our inheritance with a view to the redemption of God's own possession to the praise of his glory. This, we're sealed by the Holy Spirit. It's a seal, okay? A seal identifies Christians as belonging to God, because God owns Christians. We belong to him. Okay, so what about the forehead? Okay, so does the Bible talk about marks on the forehead? Because later in Revelation 22, there's another reference to this mark, and it says there will no longer be any curse, and the throne of God and the Lamb will be in it, and his bondservants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. So again, go to the Old Testament, look for something that can help you. And in Exodus 28:36-38, we read that you shall also make a plate of pure gold, and shall engrave on it, like the engravings of a seal, holy to the Lord. You shall fasten it to a blue cord, and it shall be on the turban. It shall be at the front of the turban. It shall be on Aaron's forehead, and Aaron shall take away the iniquity of the holy things which the sons of Israel consecrate with regard to all their holy gifts, and it shall always be on his forehead, that they may be accepted before the Lord. Okay, so this is a seal on Aaron's forehead. The seal says holy to the Lord, and the seal on the forehead symbolized that Aaron was separated unto God. He was set apart. Okay, so there it was an actual literal seal, all right, but it symbolized a spiritual seal. So in the same manner, Christians are set apart. We are separated unto God because they know God and because God knows them. So the people of Israel were reminded by the Spirit of God that they belonged to him, and that they must love the Lord their God with all their heart, with all their soul, and with all their mind. Okay, so mind. Deuteronomy 6:6 speaks of wearing the words of God as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. Okay, this refers to the commandments of God being the source of all their thinking, which is their foreheads, and all of their actions, which are their hands. All right, now they had literal boxes that they wore on the foreheads, but under the new covenant, we're not required to wear these, okay? So if there's a spiritual meaning behind this command, then the forehead represents the mind, because we have this mind of Christ. God owns our mind. He owns our eyes, the ear, the heart of every Christian, okay? He's in us. He dwells in us. He also owns our hands. He should have full authority over our thoughts and our actions and all that stuff, okay? So God's holiness, his glory, his holiness, all this stuff should become so impressed in the minds and actions of his children that he speaks of his influence as seals on our foreheads and their foreheads in Revelation. So the seal of God on Christians then is probably how they think and how they live. That's what I believe it symbolizes. Now, yes, of course, we'll be introduced to another mark later in chapter 13, the mark of the beast. All right, and that particular mark will be signified by those who worship the image of the beast And this is a seal of those who worship the beast with their minds and their actions. But there was also a literal mark as well, and I'll talk about that. But this mark or this seal tells you who your God is. Okay, so God had marked out his people, his children, by sealing them, their thoughts and their hearts. They were remembering the prophecies of Jesus. They were remembering all that had been told through this first century beginning of the gospel and the church, and they were going to be able to flee the wrath that was to come. And then we move on. There's more singing in this interlude. Salvation to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. And John makes it clear that those who sing are the saved, that they're from every nation and all tribes and peoples and all tongues. Okay, it's not just a Jewish church here, but it's a church that's made up of both Gentiles and Jews. This is the result of the evangelism that took place, the evangelism of the Gentiles by the Jewish Christians in the book of Acts. And the elders and the four living creatures continue to sing. And it's included here are the martyrs who died, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. They endured suffering on earth, and God was providing their every need in heaven. They no longer were suffering on earth, because they will hunger no longer, nor thirst anymore, nor will the sun beat down on them, nor any heat. For the Lamb in the center of the throne will be their shepherd and will guide them to the springs of the water of life, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes. And this is in 16 and 17. So this awaits all people of God in heaven, and this is the end of the interlude of chapter 7. So then we get to the seventh seal, the last one in this shall wrap this episode up. The opening of the seventh seal served two purposes. Okay, it described the response of those in heaven, and it was to introduce the blowing of the seven trumpets. It says in 8:1, when the Lamb broke the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. So this silence was not an interlude. The silence seems to be an awe and a reverence of astonishment. And it was so great in heaven that when the content of the seven sealed scroll was revealed, that there was silence for half an hour. Now, if this is interpreted literally, it would not be a typical moment of silence as we know it today at a public event, but I would say it would have to be something much greater. Wow. I'm just thinking about sitting in silence for a half an hour. Okay, so another angel came forth and stood at the altar in heaven, and he too added to the prayers of the saints as were prayed in heaven by the martyrs. And so there's more prayer was offered for the hastening of the coming judgment against apostate Israel. And it says another angel came and stood at the altar, holding a golden censer, and much incense was given to him, so that he might add it to the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar which was before the throne. So this was symbolized by the smoke of a golden censer. You remember the incense in the Old Testament temple? I believe that's what it's getting at there. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with the fire of the altar and threw it to the earth. And there followed peals of thunder and sounds and flashes of lightning and an earthquake. All right, so this was to show the awesome power and the great decree of the vengeance of God against the unbelieving Jews who rejected Christ and shed the blood of the Christians. Fire at the altar as well, another temple, a symbol of a temple there. So, there we go. we've gone through the seals and the mark of believers on their foreheads, and those who could escape, and the singing and the prayer and the martyrs and the altar. All right, so we get a glimpse of heaven again with its picture of the church at large, including a number that no man can count in verse 9, praising God. The 24 elders and the 4 living creatures are singing, and the 7th seal is broken, and the prayers for judgment against apostate Israel become multiplied. And then this concludes then the first set of the 3 sevens, and the 7 seals have been opened. Judgment has been declared upon Jerusalem, and this declaration is accompanied with the signs of a partial destruction, but it leads to the second set of the 3 sevens, the blowing of the 7 trumpets that will act as a gracious warning of God to the people of apostate Israel. All right, there's another episode down on Revelation. If you have any questions, comments, disagreements, feel free to leave a comment in the comment sections, or send me an email at thekingdomprojectpodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, be a mustard seed, be 11. Thanks for listening.